Thanks, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. Um, so, well, thanks for coming to my talk. Just a quick introduction about myself. As Aaron mentioned, I work for Cigna as a cloud security engineer. Previously, kind of held roles with general security engineering, system administration, and networking. Definitely deep dove into information security after I got interested in technology in general, and definitely enjoy a good D&D session with my friends. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I just have my handle at the bottom that's getting cut off there, but it's Prince of Pasta. So just a little bit about what goals of this talk is. I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the state of technology, specifically tying it into enterprise processes as well, and issues that might happen there. And then some approaches of how to keep up, including different tools and some strategies for that as well. Before I jump in, I did want to acknowledge some previous work that AWS has already done in their white papers. Some of the concepts come from the Cloud Adoption Framework Security Perspective white paper, and I came across that from the Incident Response Guide, which is also a pretty good read if you're getting started on a cloud platform as well. So with that, just kind of wanted to spike out how complex technology is becoming. So obviously everybody knows the kind of the technology of the day. Kubernetes has its own intricacies, pods, deployments, all the technology that runs on top of it. And then you have your three cloud platforms that each have 150 plus services that all have their different levels of abstraction. You have different CI/CD vendors, like we just heard from GitLab. There's Jenkins and Circle.ci and others. Ansible, Terraform, and Helm, different deployment technologies to actually deliver your application. So it's extremely hard to be a master of all these things. And then even if you feel really comfortable with all of these, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation comes along and gives you the landscape of just an exhausting number of technologies out there that you just can't hope to master. So what that comes down to is everything is, it's too complex for one person to know. So I'm just going to downsize these slides real quick just so people can see it. Cool. So not everybody knows everything about that there is to know about a specific technology. It's just too much for any one person. So kind of typically what that leads to on both sides, whether you are going through a process yourself or kind of the recipient of that process, you submit a ticket, you don't know enough about that technology, you missed a hidden field that reviewers knows about but you don't, and it gets rejected. You submit it again, it gets assigned to a different person who has a different set of concerns. They might know more about technology X or Y, but you also miss something else and they reject it again. So then 2 weeks later, you finally get it processed, and then nobody updates the documentation on how to do that process appropriately. And then it just keeps happening to 5, 10, 15 other people. And maybe it gets fixed in a year. So with just the way enterprise processes work, sometimes it takes a while to fix that. So it's a huge error-prone process, and then it just wastes a bunch of people's time as well. So with this, it kind of leads to inconsistent compliance. So as I kind of mentioned with the different reviewers, you have a different concept of what is good enough. If nobody kind of writes it down, it's just up to that reviewer. And then you also start shopping for yes. If you previously worked with somebody that gave you the yes, you're going to work with them again or try to finagle your way to work with them again so you can get that yes and keep moving and deliver value for your customer there, which just inherently creates single points of failure. If you can only work and you're relying on that person to come to every single meeting, as that grows to a large enterprise, that person can only scale so much. So they kind of become a choke point there. And then there's also kind of the but you let them do it kind of argument, where if you have a reviewer that isn't aware of something that you're trying to push more globally as a compliance piece, and they say yes, they'll point to it and then expect you to say okay as well. So has anybody kind of experienced this from being in a large enterprise? Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, and then kind of as Emily had mentioned, there's kind of definitely the different definition of heroes as well. So on both sides, again, of submitting tickets and kind of receiving those processes, people are kind of get praised for being able to navigate that process efficiently and deliver. And then also if they're that kind of single point of failure where they are trying to actually help teams do it the right way, they get so busy that there's no time to share. You can't. Their calendars just get filled up with meetings. Sometimes you see quadruple or quintuple booked, and they have to pick which meeting to attend because they're just that swamped. But what that just leads to is kind of burnout, and all that institutional knowledge is just in their head, kind of stuck there, not making it onto any wiki site like a Confluence or anything like that. So how do we start fixing this? It may seem kind of like common sense a little bit, but starting with documentation is kind of the core fundamentals there, and then you can start building more advanced stuff based off that documentation, like detection, prevention, remediation, and then inner-sourcing also has a piece to tie into that. So jumping right into documentation, Ramsey from the 10 Commandments kind of got it over 60 years ago. It's not done until it's written down. So if you don't capture it somewhere, there's kind of no hope to somebody being able to adhere to that. So beyond just going to you can think of your high-level security policies that might not mean a lot of things to a developer day to day. You need to map those down to a very technical level. So looking at things like encryption or logging or high availability, with all the different technologies that I've kind of listed on this slide, that means different things depending on what technology you're using. So something like an S3, that might be a specific parameter on the S3 bucket to say you have to encrypt at rest there. But it may mean something different on a VM in an EC2 box or another cloud provider's kind of virtual machine technology where you have to do operating system level logging or an application level logging. So breaking down those little differences and exactly what you mean when you say X really helps, gives a how-to guide, if you will, to developers and other teams that are trying to stay compliant with what's expected there. The big thing here too is if you can centralize that documentation rather than just writing it from one viewpoint. Working at a large company, I definitely see it a lot where folks have Confluence and then they find their own space for it for their team and write down exactly what applies to their team, but there's no centralization and learnings across different teams like security, like operations. And if you can capture that all in one spot, it's kind of that one-stop shop for everything that's expected for getting to production. And if there are other key stakeholders, if there's anybody through like financial transparency where they want to see certain tags or anything like that, you can also include them as well. So moving on to detection, the cool thing that I'm super excited about with Kubernetes, and I know there's a lot of complexity with all these technologies, but a lot of these platforms have really great APIs that you can start talking to. So whereas on-premise technologies were a little tougher to interact with and actually ask about, there's definitely been some great advances with the cloud platforms and stuff like Kubernetes. So for more traditional stuff, you might see OS Query or Tanium in larger enterprises being able to almost Google search your infrastructure and say, hey, do we have any devices that are doing X, or is this program running anywhere? And then you can also kind of pivot that and look at the cloud platforms to say, am I seeing any S3 buckets that are misconfigured? Are there any public S3 buckets? Is there anybody that's running an internet gateway in any of their accounts? So you can kind of phrase those questions and write queries for that and keep interrogating the infrastructure for that, what you're expecting there. And then the cool thing with this, you can also, if you can pipe that the right way with alerting or self-service, get it in front of the development teams themselves. So you don't have to wait until you get to a review meeting just to say, are you compliant with it? If they can look at a portal or get an alert in a chat channel or something like that, whenever you see something that's out of compliance, they can start self-fixing it. You can link back to the documentation on what the expectation is there and kind of reduce those meetings and kind of make them more efficient as well. So while detection is great, preventing it from ever occurring at all is definitely preferred. So kind of like I mentioned as well, with some of these newer technologies, there's some great ways to interact with the platforms. So if you look at AWS, IAM permissions or service control policies, if you're familiar with AWS organizations where you can kind of blacklist actions across the entire organization, you can prevent an action from occurring at the when somebody tries to go to spin up that resource rather than waiting until it exists in the environment as well. And then looking at Kubernetes, there's also things like pod security policies or admission controllers where you're looking to see to make sure that when somebody tries to schedule a deployment or another type of resource on the cluster, to make sure that it's not running as root, or you're looking it's coming from a certain registry or anything like that, you can kind of make conditions there. And then if you move from the platform over to the pipeline, so before it ever touches the platform as well, you could look at different codes for kind of static scanning. So there's CFN nag out there if you work with CloudFormation. Sentinel from HashiCorp is also pretty ingrained with their different tools, specifically referring to Terraform here, where you can say you can't launch an instance unless it's in a certain region. And then I also recently came across CompTest, which is an open source tool that I found on GitHub that's trying to kind of be more generic policy as code language across a lot of different files. So with CompTest, I did want to do a quick demo as well, tempting the demo gods by doing a live demo, but it's just going to go through a quick Kubernetes deployment file or two, look at the policy files that'll be used, and then we'll jump into the command line and see what the tool looks like. So bring this back, should be able to view this. So right here, I just have a YAML file for kind of typical deployment, has a couple labels. I did pull these examples from the CompTest GitHub repo as well. So just slightly modified them for the demo. But you can see we're just making 3 replicas of a specific image. It's running on port 8080. And then we're just going to take a look at the Rego files, which is kind of the policy language that CompTest use. So this first Rego file basically just is an abstraction of a Boolean check, just check if the input.kind is deployment. So if we look back here, because if we scroll to the top of the file, we see that the kind is deployment. So this would return true if we're evaluating it against this file. So jumping to our other Rego file, we can see that we are importing that other file that we just created, kubernetes.rego, so import data.kubernetes. And then we're also grabbing the name, similarly like we did with the kind with the Kubernetes file. So we're just grabbing the name there. And then we're using that is deployment function in a deny message. So on line 9 here, we have looking to see if the security context run as root is under spec, template spec, security context run as root. And if it's not true. And if it's not, it will say, we will error out and say containers must run as root in deployment, and then we use that name variable. So if we run this really quick, because our root deployment does not have that security context under the spec template spec, there's nothing there. So if we do that real quick, I just downloaded the binary and put it in my path. So that's how I'm able to just run this command. And then if I run it against our root deployment.yaml, we can see we get a fail message that just says, hey, that exact error message with the name of the deployment is right there. And so you could imagine just putting this into a pipeline, whatever your pipeline definition file could be, you could just run this before it touches the Kubernetes cluster. So then if we wanted to correct this, I've just created a parallel file called deployment.yaml, pretty much the same exact thing. The only thing I've added is that security context on line 21 and 22 to tell it to not run as root. So now if I rerun the same command, and then run it against our deployment file instead of the root deployment YAML, we get a 0 return code, so we could proceed past that if we were running it in a pipeline. So there's definitely a lot of flexibility in the language as well, so you could look for specific labels being there. It's pretty extensible depending on how you want to combine those conditions, but just kind of gives you a different view of how you might be able to apply kind of static checks, policy as code in a pipeline, or even manually on a desktop before you commit it to the source control as well. So with that, kind of beyond prevention and detection, if something does get by those controls somehow, think about auto remediation. Again, kind of leveraging those same APIs that we've looked at from the detective and the preventative controls. Can we just, when we see something, have something take care of it and not have to worry about it, not introduce human toil and all that. So if you're familiar with AWS, Cloud Custodian is obviously a clear player in that space. AWS Config, which is one of their native services, also takes care of it. And there's plenty of commercial tools that do this too. You can even roll your own with CloudWatch events and lambdas that say when this API action happens, kick off this lambda, decide if I need to take an action and go do it. So I have the do nothing box kind of on here just as an example here. So if you see somebody create a public S3 bucket, you could have an auto remediation lambda that goes ahead and makes it private again. Or if they add an account admin to their role, you could auto yank that. So you can definitely do those kind of things, but I do just kind of caution that with make it noisy and make it known that you're doing it. So whether that be a chat channel, an email or something saying, hey, we took this action in your account, in your namespace, depending on the platform. Why was that taken? Maybe link to the documentation on why it was taken. And then also be careful for like infinite loops and breaking the state of the deployment. So if you're using something like an auto scaling group and you keep shutting down a box, but the automation keeps standing up a box, you kind of just get an infinite loop that nobody's kind of aware of. Or Terraform or some of these state-driven deployment tools, if you start messing with the state behind the scenes without kind of informing the automation about that, it may get unhappy with you and not be able to deploy. And then the last point too, with context is key. The more you can know about a specific resource and the specific scenario is and how it's being used, you may decide to do something differently. So if it's highly sensitive data in a production account, you might treat it differently than if it's in a sandbox account where somebody's allowed to just kind of kick the tires on a new technology. So having things like tags, metadata about the account or the resource is definitely helpful for deciding what to do there. And then the last kind of strategy, definitely inner sourcing. So working at a 80,000 person company, it's definitely tough when there's so many people doing so many different things. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are solving the same problem. So encouraging people to work with each other. With all these deployment tools and kind of template-driven infrastructure as code tools, it's beyond just building patterns from just a reusability standpoint. You can also start burning in controls from security, from operations, and other stakeholders. So you can think of something like a CloudFormation, like a Terraform, where you could say, make sure to encrypt at rest, make sure to add an SSL certificate when you create that thing. So you can start burning in those requirements from the beginning. So when somebody goes to build something new, it's already included in that template that they can use, and they don't have to start from zero. And then the cool thing about this as well, the documentation and the other controls that you built through the other strategies kind of help verify it. So the documentation should read like a how-to guide on saying you must do X, Y, and Z. And then once you deploy it in a test environment before you call it official version 1, you could verify it and see if the detection picks up on if it's compliant or not, or auto remediation takes an action against it or anything like that. But basically, it's a great way to start raising the bar continuously for everybody across the company. So since this is a DevOps conference, I figured I'd connect it back to the 3 ways as well. So kind of talking about that, doing it right the first time and not sending known defects. So as you start using new technologies and documenting it, figuring out the right way to do it from the security perspective, operations perspective, you start kind of raising that bar and figuring out the right way to do it so that when an operations person has to respond to an incident, they already do have the logs that they need or anything like that. And then kind of that feedback loop, whether that be that detection, the auto remediation, just getting it back in front of that development team to make sure that they're aware of what's going on, and also getting that feedback before they even make it to production to see if something they're developing is getting flagged as a misconfiguration. And then kind of that third way, building out that library of infrastructure as code and being compliant from the start. You get that constant improvement of you always learn from any net new project. And then the experimentation piece also comes from the fact that you've kind of codified and made it easier to do that undifferentiated heavy lifting, and then people can focus in on what really produces value for what people are building for your company. So if you kind of, what would I like you to take away from this talk? Documentation is the foundation to all the other kind of strategies there. It is definitely key and kind of writes the book for the others. And then also cross-linking from everywhere. So if you have a wiki, if you have a chat platform, if you have your infrastructure as code in a Git repository, just crossing those links to make sure wherever somebody starts with, wherever they come across your approach, they're at least able to find why the tools are built the way they are, or what's informing each of the different steps. And then just the last comment too about chat platforms. So if you have a Slack, Mattermost, HipChat, there's a bunch of different technologies out there. But leveraging public channels for that inner sourcing piece is super important as well. So somebody I worked with definitely had a great strategy too, where if he got a private question about a specific approach, rather than answer that in the private message, he would repeat it to a public channel in that community so everybody could learn from it. So kind of just, again, raising that bar. And if you keep seeing the same questions over and over in a public channel, that's probably a good candidate for updating the documentation on figuring out a standard way to do it. So let's check back in on our developer going through that process. Rather than dealing with that kind of onerous process that we saw at the beginning of the talk, you could start with looking at a pattern or solutions library, whether that be a Git repository. There's also a couple different kind of service catalog style UIs or APIs out there, and they could review those, pick the relevant one that they're doing, and then because it's already been approved, it's already kind of been blessed by those various stakeholders that need to give the thumbs up before you can go to production. You can just deploy one of those instances to production and start focusing on what really creates value for your customer there. So obviously that reduces the time and kind of makes it, you're being more effective as a company and allowing your development team to do what they need to do. So with that, just wanted to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. It's my first public talk, so if you do have any thoughts or questions, feel free to stop me afterwards. And thank you for the opportunity.